I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You there once in your life.
Hey, people. Trish Wood here, and this is Trish Wood is Critical. And it's a show about critical thinking, and boy, do we need it now. We are on the brink of possibly a nuclear war. And we broached some of this last week. This week's show is kind of an addendum to last week's show. We had on Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who may be the smartest military commentator out there right now, at least in my view, and I hope yours too. And also we had Ava Bartlett, the independent foreign correspondent, reporting to us from the eastern region of the Donbass in a place called Donetsk. And you could hear the shells popping in the background. So she is the real deal. And that interview with her kind of felt like old school CBC to me. It kind of felt like the thing that Barbara Frum would have been doing on As It Happens back in the olden days. Not that I'm comparing myself to Barbara Frum at all, but that they wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole now because they're too busy using U.S. State Department talking points. So it was kind of moving in a way that Ava has the courage to keep on going while shells are popping not very far from where she was stationed at the time we spoke. So that was last week. This week is the one and only Scott Horton, who I've been wanting to talk to for a very, very long time. He is the chief at antiwar.com. He runs the Libertarian Institute. He has a podcast and a radio show, and he's written a whole bunch of books. One of them called Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which I completely agree with. Plus Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And the great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show, interviews 2004 to 2019. So he is a force to be reckoned with, Scott. Scott knows more about American foreign policy and the hideous mistakes it keeps making and repeating than probably anybody I've encountered in my quite considerable lifetime at this point. I'm not going to say my age again, but you know. And if you want proof of that and you want to be uplifted, watch the debate between Scott Horton and Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol, the neocon, never met a war he didn't like, fixture in Washington, D.C. I believe he is the editor of something called The Bulwark. He's an anti-Trump Republican and has been moving around in those circles for a very, very long time. And so what was interesting about their debate was it was kind of like shooting fish in a barrel for Scott. You know, the facts are on the side of people who are saying, cut with the regime change wars, knock it off, cut it out, nothing good ever comes of them. And I was actually surprised at how bad Bill Kristol was at making the case for the wars he'd supported, including the absolutely disastrous Iraq War. I mean, there was literally no casus belli. There was no reason for them to go in. They invented one, right? Weapons of mass destruction. And they always come up with these kind of, well, we were there so women could go to school. We were there. We had to fight them there so they don't come here. They have all these, really annoying talking points. But they left the country in a disaster. Hundreds of thousands of people died for nothing. American kids came back from that war limbless and without being even able to justify the sacrifice they made. So that's who Bill Kristol is. Bill Kristol and his ilk, right? Max Boot and the rest of them. They send other people's kids to war recklessly, and they get away with it. They make money doing it too. So Scott Horton is our guest. But I want to talk to you a little bit about where we're going. Scott is on in part because we're going to talk about the nuclear war threat. That's huge. I've mentioned it on the last few shows, and I do that because it's real. And because legacy media is not really dealing with it in a responsible way. And I kind of always assumed that everybody knew what I know about it. But then I realized, like, I'm older than most people. So I have a whole kind of filing cabinet of knowledge in my head that a couple of generations of young people have not been exposed to. So they don't really understand how ludicrous it is to suggest that limited nuclear war is a good idea. It's not. And so I think we have to revisit some of the basic frameworks around how nuclear war would play out. And we're going to do that with Scott Horton. And we are also going to talk about many, many other things. America's ongoing push for hegemonistic power around the world. And under this crew in Washington right now, I mean, Jake Sullivan's been around the State Department for years, making the same mistakes over and over again. So that's what we're going to do today. You're going to love him. Stick around. I want to announce something that happened yesterday that I found quite soothing. And that is that Tulsi Gabbard, who is kind of my spirit animal, she quit the Democratic Party yesterday. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's exciting. And she gave a lovely little speech about why she did it. And I'm going to play that for you now, and then we can talk about it a bit more after.
I can no longer remain in today's Democratic Party that's under the complete control of an elitist cabal of warmongers who are driven by cowardly wokeness, who divide us by racializing every issue and stoking anti-white racism, who actively work to undermine our God-given freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution, who are hostile to people of faith and spirituality, who demonize the police but protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding Americans, who believe in open borders, who weaponize the national security state to go after their political opponents, and above all, who are dragging us ever closer to nuclear war. Now, I believe in a government that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. Unfortunately, today's Democratic Party does not. Instead, it stands for a government that is of, by, and for the powerful elite. Now, I'm calling on my fellow common sense, independent-minded Democrats to join me in leaving the Democratic Party. If you can no longer stomach the direction that the so-called woke Democratic Party ideologues are taking our country, and I invite you to join me.
So that was Tulsi Gabbard explaining why she left the Democratic Party yesterday. It's quite good, don't you think? Great line. Elitist cabal of warmongers driven by cowardly wokeness. Woo! That just about sums it up. So cheer for Tulsi. This was a long time coming, obviously. And of course, Bill Kristol was one of the first people out of the box to say clearly she is a Putin apologist for feeling that way. So that's what they do. If you disagree with them, you're a Putin apologist. And it's wearing really, really thin right now. And that attitude is also leading us to the brink of something quite terrible. So she's great for doing that. The other interesting thing that I saw online yesterday was at a venue where AOC was giving a speech about something, and two young men in the audience jumped up to admonish her about not being more interested in seeking peace in Ukraine. Isn't that great? It's like the young people are finding their voice. So listen to these two young chaps as they take AOC on for not demanding an end to the war. And it's interesting, too, her only response is that they're being rude. How do you like that?
Congresswoman, none of this matters unless there's a nuclear war, which you voted to send arms and weapons to Ukraine. Tulsi Gabbard, she's left the Democratic Party because they're a bunch of war hawks, okay? You originally voted, you ran as an outsider, yet you've been voting to start this war in Ukraine. You're voting to start a thermonuclear war with Russia and China. Why are you playing with the lives of American citizens? You're playing with our lives.
There will be no neighbors if there's a nuclear bomb. You voted to mobilize and send money to Ukrainian Nazis. You're a coward. You're a progressive socialist. Where are you against the war mobilization? He's telling the right truth. You have done nothing. Tulsi Gabbard has shown guts where you've shown cowardice. I believed in you, and you became the very thing you sought to fight against. That's what you've become. You are the establishment, and you are the reason why everybody will end up in a nuclear war unless you choose to stand up right now and denounce the Democratic Party. Will you do that? Yes or no? Okay, simple. Are you going to stop nuclear war? Yes or no? There is no line, because this is bullshit. None of this matters if we're all dead. None of it. You know that. Then let's take it up right now, because this is the only thing that matters. This is the only thing that matters right now. We could be in a nuclear war at any minute, and you continue to fund it. That's what's going on. Why not right now? You're the liar here. Nobody has held you accountable. That's what's happening. And it is time for you to stand up and realize that what you've been saying has been lies. Let your conscience come through for once.
She is the biggest fraud going, I have to say. Like, calling these kids rude. These are the people who voted her in office because she was edgy and lefty and progressive, and one would assume anti-war. But of course, once she gets in there, she might as well be, working for the defense industry. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Their response to her, I will say this, was absolutely appropriate. I completely agree with what they did. And what did she say? You're being rude. That's her response to these young people saying, we don't want to get nuked, right? Just ridiculous. And I just want to move on from that by saying that, we've had people on talking about the Nazi presence in Ukraine. And of course, legacy media, before February 2022, were talking about it. And after 2022, after the war started, they started denying the existence of the Nazis and the far right groups in Ukraine. But I'm just going to read some of their headlines so you know. And these are from like CTV and BBC and Political, right? So I'll just read a few. Far right fighters from Europe fight for Ukraine. Nazi symbols salutes on display Ukrainian nationalist march. Yes, it's still okay to call Ukraine C-14 neo-Nazis. A new Eurasian far right rising. CTV, far-right extremists in Ukrainian military bragged about Canadian training, report says. German TV shows Nazi symbols on helmets of Ukraine soldiers. Ukraine designates national holiday to commemorate Nazi collaborator. I mean, come on, people. Kiev's far-right groups refuse to disarm. FBI, neo-Nazi militia trained by U.S. military in Ukraine, now training U.S. white supremacists. I mean, it's going on and on and on, right? There's many, many examples here. So they try to hide this when it's not in the interest of prosecuting the conflict that the State Department is currently prosecuting. It's incredible how legacy media gets in line, even though there's a record of what they said before. So let's do my pitch now so we can get right to Scott Horton, who's wonderful. We are listener supported. And that means you. And we are listener supported because we live in a world now where the conversation is highly, highly suppressed by censorship. And the big corporations now that place advertising wield a lot of power. And you also know that they're pretty woke. The big companies are pretty woke. So we are, at the moment anyway, still going with being listener funded. And we would sure appreciate a contribution from you if you like what we're doing here. You can go to my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com, and there's a support button, Patreon, PayPal, and now we're on Substack too. So let me explain. Patreon can be censorious, so we watch what we post there, and we're trying to move everybody from Patreon over to Substack. PayPal has been called out for some pretty bad behavior. So that's another reason why, if you're going to make a choice about where to go for us, we'd be grateful if you moved over to Substack, which has staked claim to the territory of not censoring people. So that would be wonderful. And we really appreciate it too. And I also appreciate hearing from you at info@trishwoodpodcast.com. I have a whole bunch of emails stacked up that I need to answer, and I will be doing that this week. So hold tight, and I will respond to you if you send me an email. I read them all. I just don't get a chance to respond as quickly as I'd like to. I'm going to be in Bedeck, Nova Scotia at the Free Speech and Medicine Conference with a whole bunch of magnificent people, including Jay Bhattacharya and Bruce Party. And you can go there if you want to come and see us. Please do go to their website, which is freespeechandmedicine.com. We would absolutely love to see you there. And Bedeck is wonderful. So please do that. And okay, let's move on to my interview with Scott. So Scott has been around for a long time and is very, very well versed in all of the regime change debacles that have plagued America. And it never seems to learn its lessons. And now we are watching in Ukraine a proxy war. Clearly, America wants to depose Putin through this proxy war. That's what they're really trying to do. The State Department's been mucking around in Ukraine for a very, very long time. We talk about that and play some tape of Toria Nuland, who was in the Ukraine trying to exert American power in 2008 and 2014, I believe, is when it's from. So we talk about that. And then at the end, we talk about his research into nuclear weapons and nuclear war. And you will also hear us talking about If You Love This Planet, the film by Helen Caldicott, which I'm going to play a little piece of in our extra to the show today. So here is my conversation with the great Scott Horton. Hi, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm thrilled. You and Colonel McGregor are two of the people I feel the need to turn to when things are going south in the world. So I'm really, really glad to actually have you on the podcast. I know our listeners will be keen to hear your point of view. And I actually, I have these little kind of private Twitter DM rooms, and lots of people say in them, I wonder what Scott Horton is thinking about this. So I know that they'll be thrilled that I had you on today.
Great.
I want to start just by asking you a kind of a general and a broad question, given that you see and I see and others see what a dangerous place we're in right now. If I was to ask you historically how we got here yet again, what would your answer be?
Well, it's all Bill Clinton and George W. Bush's fault, really. But of course, that also means Obama, Trump, and Biden. And ever since, 30 years since and look, if you go back to the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, America had already befriended the Chinese 20 years before that. So that Cold War was already over. The Soviet Union fell apart and America declared the doctrine, as of course, and many of your listeners know, in the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992 for 1994 through the end of the century, was this is our unipolar moment, and we will essentially create such a powerful military world empire that no nation will even think of attempting to challenge our might. And if they try, or any combination of nations try, we will go to preemptive war against them to bring their power back down again. There will be a Pax Americana on the earth from now on. And that was the doctrine. And that was the doctrine in the Middle East that, of course, ended up generating, turning America's mercenary terrorists against the United States in the form of bin Laden's war against America that culminated in the September 11th attack, which then became the trigger for 20 years of absolute catastrophe from Pakistan to Nigeria. And, from the Philippines to Nigeria. Yeah. And then, of course, the same doctrine meant, and you can go back and look at in the original Defense Planning Guidance or look in Rebuilding America's Defenses, the doctrine of the Project for New American Century, which was the Paul Wolfowitz joint to work on lying us into war. A huge part of that is NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. And so then the question was, even then, are we going to bring Russia into the New Deal, or is the new thing going to be pointed against them? After all, if we're going to bring Russia into NATO, the question is, well, who are we going to war against next? China? Well, they're our biggest trading partner. We love them. We don't want to fight China. So I guess we could team up with Russia against Islamic South Asia. And so we have different interests in terms of fighting the terror war. America's mostly on the side of Al-Qaeda. The Russians are terrified of them. And the Russians are mostly on the side of Iran. And America hates Iran. And so, and also Russia is a big and powerful enough country that if America brought them into NATO, we really would have to share power and decision-making with them in a way that we don't have to share decision-making with the Germans or, you know, some of the smaller states in Eastern Europe who do what they're told because of the leverage we have over them. So instead it was decided that we just do all this NATO expansion at Russia's expense. And the Russians have said from the time of when Gorbachev was even still in power, but certainly from the very early Yeltsin years, they said, please don't expand NATO at our expense in a way that leaves us on the outside. Let's have a common European home. Let's have a common security architecture. Let's build up the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe instead of NATO. Or as some American former hawks even recommended, let's bring Russia into NATO first and then bring in the states in Eastern Europe in between Western Europe and Russia. That way, everybody understands what we're doing here and that this is not supposed to be at their expense. And that the Eastern European states will also understand that this isn't really to protect you from Russia. This is to integrate you into the same security architecture so that none of us fight. Sort of, you know, a grand European Union alliance all the way to Vladivostok kind of thing. So, but instead they picked a fight. And you go back to 2008, Fiona Hill, the War Party high priestess, you know, who helped impeach Trump and is obviously one of the worst Russia hawks. She has confirmed that the CIA told W. Bush, don't try to bring Ukraine into NATO. If you do, the Russians are going to freak out and cause a major problem. And we know because of Chelsea Manning and the great hero Julian Assange, who's still sitting in prison for bringing us this truth, that our current CIA director, William Burns, had written a memo to Condoleezza Rice in February of 2008 called Niet Means Niet. Everyone can read it at wikileaks.org, where he says it's not just Putin and Lavrov, it's the entire defense establishment and security establishment in Moscow are just absolutely dead set against membership for Ukraine or Georgia in NATO, and we would be wise to not do this. Now, Bush wanted to bring him in right then, but what happened? The Germans and the French insisted that he not, for one reason only. It'll unnecessarily antagonize the Russians. We don't want to do that. But Bush insisted, and so instead announced this sort of half measure that, well, we're putting Ukraine on the fast track to get them into NATO and Georgia too. As soon or later, you know, as soon as we can, somehow or another. And of course, they started integrating Ukraine into NATO in a de facto way ever since then.
Well, what's interesting about what you're saying is that you could be talking in a sense about the Cuban Missile Crisis, just so people understand how Russia feels about a buildup on its border, right? They feel it's an existential threat to have NATO bringing Ukraine into the party, don't they?
Sure. And look, if you put the shoe on the other foot for a minute, it sounds crazy, right? It sounds absolutely absurd to think, well, what would we do if the Russians overthrew the government of Canada twice in 10 years in fake revolutions, but not a really NED, you know, / CIA sponsored coup d'etats, or, you know, I guess in their case, it would be the FSB sponsored coup d'etats. They use legit, you know, hardcore right-wing nationalists, even neo-Nazis, to help accomplish their coup. They kick Americans out of our naval base, or try to kick us out of our naval bases in Alaska. And then they declare war on the people of Vancouver, British Columbia, who refused to accept the rule of the new coup d'etat junta that overthrew the government that they had elected. And now they're building up their military forces, Russian military forces, across the river from New York State. what would America do then? America would invade Canada, crush the regime in Ottawa, and probably nuke Moscow is what would happen then. And everybody knows it. And everybody knows that when I explain that scenario, if the Russians were doing this, this, and that in Canada, everybody knows that we're talking about comic book, ridiculous fantasy. They wouldn't even make a Marvel movie out of that. It's so completely ridiculous. You couldn't. Russia would never do that to us, would never try that in Canada anytime in the next 500 years. No way. And yet we feel like we can just do this, right?
It's very interesting that you put it that way. It's a perfect kind of example of how Russia's feeling, but it also highlights a really important point. And I don't think we talk about this as much as we should. People now in the West have a very, very limited and superficial understanding of history. Not my listeners, who are pretty sophisticated, but I would say most people don't understand why that analogy even works. They have no clue. They bought completely into the fiction that Ukraine is a plucky little democratic country, and and that this is a fight against good and evil, et cetera, et cetera. And they buy into it. Why do they? They do because they don't understand the actual history in the region. Right. And the mainstream media is not talking about it.
Robert Higgs, the great libertarian economist, had this phrase about Pearl Harbor and about how all the historians, especially the popular, mythology on TV, they always truncate the antecedents, he said. In fact, I think that's even the title of an article, Truncating the Antecedents. In other words, not telling you what happened before the big thing happened, right? FDR deliberately put an embargo on oil and steel and bragged about his support for China and selling them planes and all of these things in order to deliberately provoke Japan into attacking us. That's what he wanted to happen so he could get into the war in Europe. That's the fact. His Secretary of Defense, Stimson, wrote in his diary, the entire object was how to maneuver Japan into firing the first shot in a way that would not lead to too much damage to ourselves, right? But then what do? They say, well, those round glasses, bucktooth having, ne'er-do-wells, they attacked us due to the evil inside them. Same thing with Al-Qaeda and their war against the United States. Why ever would they do this? Well, you see, if you believe in Islam to an extreme enough degree, it makes you want to suicide people who love their mama. Yeah, that must be what it is. But in fact, no, America is the world empire, and everyone knows that because everyone listening to this has said themselves, we're number one. USA, the superpower. There used to be two superpowers. Then the Soviet Union disappeared. Now there is one superpower, us. So don't pretend like, oh, we're the sleeping giant and all this stuff keeps happening to us. Iraq wasn't preparing to attack us. We were the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor in that one, right, everybody? That was just 20 years ago. And in fact, let's see, early mid-October, 20 years ago, what were they saying? They were saying, we have to do this. And if you're not for it, then you're a traitor. If you know better than to confuse Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, you're a traitor to your country. You support terrorism against America. Worse than a communist. You're a bin Ladenite. If you don't want to attack Saddam Hussein's Baathists, Ronald Reagan's old little playthings. And people bought that because it was a narrative and because, as you say, they didn't know the first thing about it. They didn't even know where Iraq was. All they knew was we get to engage in some bloodlust and some violence because the president says it's okay. So it's okay. So let's go blow something up. As Wolfowitz himself said, Iraq is doable. So let's go.
Well, it was astonishing to watch. I mentioned to you before we rolled that I saw your debate with Bill Kristol, of which you won the day times 10. But what was interesting to me as someone, I wrote a book about the Iraq War and from the soldier's perspective. So, I feel somewhat protective of the guys who served in something that turned out to be a fallacy,
Sure.
and who have the extra struggle as a result of that, making sense of having no limbs in a misbegotten war. It's what surprises me about all these guys, Max Boot and Bill Kristol and John Bolton and all these people, is how cavalier they are, with the big sweeping verbal gestures about sending other kids away. That's a very kind of naive, I suppose, lefty perspective. But it matters that they're sending these kids off into things that make no sense and will do no one any good, and at the end of the day cause only heartbreak. And they don't seem to struggle. Like Bill Kristol doesn't seem upset that this project in Iraq failed so miserably. He does not seem to be having any kind of moral quandary within himself about it. That's what shocks me.
Yeah.
Maybe it shouldn't, but it does.
I've been looking for this footnote, and then somebody told me it wasn't Nixon. It was Kissinger in one of his books. I thought it was Nixon says this. It's not the famous, discussion where they're talking about nuking North Vietnam and flooding them with, blowing up the dikes and stuff. It's different. Yeah. Everybody knows that one where Kissinger's like, well, geez, Mr. President, I'm afraid the world would think of you as a butcher. But anyway, someone was telling me it was in one of Kissinger's books where he explains very clearly, essentially, that there's a totally separate and different morality involved in statecraft. Of course, people are dying. When we're talking about a government is a monopoly on the right to initiate violence on other people or on the authority to, right? So, yes, they kill people. They kill them all the time. That's the whole point. But the thing is, as he says, and there's something about, if civilians in Vietnam are dying in our war against their government, well, that's just their problem. And that as people who are making decisions on the level of statecraft, we only are essentially engaging on a government to government level. And it's a wholly separate and different morality, as though we were talking about gods on Mount Olympus, who can do things to each other and can do things to us mere mortals that us mere mortals can't understand why that should be permissible or whatever. But that's what it is. That, look, if you're in the business of government, then, yeah, they're toy soldiers. You use them, and as Henry Kissinger himself said, they're just dumb animals. That's the point of view of people in power. They are to be used to commit the acts of violence, and then, yeah, they get killed in the acts of violence. They knew that when they signed up, right? Come on. And so they don't have to think about it at all. They just write it off. You didn't want to be in the Army. You shouldn't have joined the Army, pal. Or you should have been at, draft age at the time we were drafting people. And, of course, John Bolton, Bill Kristol, all those guys, they got out of Vietnam. They figured out how to get college educated enough and married enough and bone spurred enough or whatever their excuses were. Dick Cheney said, well, I had other priorities at that time.
I know.
Like another 60,000 Americans who got killed over there and another couple of 100,000 who got wounded over there didn't. But that's just how they are. In fact, Jonah Goldberg, people are trying to recycle Jonah Goldberg as somehow, anything more moral than the worst people in America. You know what I mean? Like he might as well be a neo-Nazi or a convicted child molester or whatever. Jonah Goldberg, the editor of the National Review that killed 1 million Iraqis, that guy who wrote Baghdad Delenda Est and Baghdad Delenda Est Part 2 about how, from the same point of view, we got
look at David Frum.
We should to remake the Middle East the way we want it to be.
Yeah. Look at David Frum. I mean, this is an aside. I used to work for his mother, Barbara, who was one of the premier journalists in this country, and watching her in action taught me a lot about how to interview people and how to think. In fact, she was an amazing human being. And I often wonder what she would think about how far David has fallen. I mean, it's just he's just embarrassing, right? It's just,
he's the guy that wrote The Right Man, the hagiography of W. Bush.
Yeah.
And he's the guy that wrote the Axis of Evil speech, which in 2002 in the State of the Union, he and Richard Pearl, worked together to come up with this. And they told the American people that Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and Osama bin Laden were all in an alliance against us. You know, like Italy, Germany, and Japan in the Second World War, the Axis alliance, Saddam and the Ayatollah and Osama bin Laden. Yeah. Come on. Now, it's true that Bill Clinton helped Iran ship weapons to bin Laden's men in Bosnia back in 94, but still, like, that was when they were all working together with America. That was completely ridiculous, and they knew that they were lying. They just wanted the American people to understand the war over there is going to continue. 9/11 is just the excuse to go ahead. And Bush said over and over again to lie us into Iraq. He said, I mean, some of these quotes are just amazing to read, where he says, imagine September 11th happening again. Only this time, bin Laden's men armed with Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Like, imagine that, huh? You know, it's just, you imagine whatever you want to, if you want to. And that was how they pushed people into that war. And, you know, anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, because the point really is how they're building this consensus about Russia right now. That don't you know that when it's Hitler, you have to stand up to Hitler, and just whatever ridiculous little cliches with no understanding, no ability for Americans to admit. Just think about it. Your presidents have been, never mind all of the rest of us in the country, us wonderful, wonderful people, but our presidents have been Bill Clinton, W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. With the Clintons and the Bidens and the McCains and the Romneys and those kind of centrists, the Bush sort of centrists of the worst nature, led by the neoconservatives, Bill Kristol and his men. At the height of Bush power, they're Bush guys. At the height of Biden's power or Obama's power, they're Obama ballots or Biden supporters, you know? And these are the people who've been in charge. Like, if I told you Bill Clinton, the guy who was on Jeffrey Epstein's airplane to Thailand, that guy made bad decisions about American foreign policy in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Like, could you buy that? Would that blow your mind to say that W. Bush, despite good advice, did the wrong thing more than one or two times during his charge? This shouldn't be a hard argument at all, but it takes a willingness to think about it for a minute. It takes a willingness to not be, frankly, a tiny crybaby, emotional little child saying, oh, when you're accusing America of doing the wrong thing. You're blaming America first. Oh, when I cry and put my hand on my heart when they sing the song. And so you're not allowed to point out the fact that America expanded its military alliance right up to essentially de facto 300 miles from Moscow. And that the president of the government of Russia had said nonstop for 15 years leading up to that, you know, this could lead to violence.
Well, that was known. And what happens when anybody says what you just said, or what Tulsi Gabbard said recently when she stepped away from the Democratic Party, the criticism from your old friend Bill Kristol was, well, obviously, you know, she's a Putin stooge or something. I mean, it's getting really old. You know, it's just, if that is the level of discussion that we're going to have around what is perhaps the closest we've been to nuclear war, well, it is, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, if that's the response, does he really believe that? I will have played before we come to you a clip of Max Boot going after Stephen Cohen and calling him a Putin apologist on Anderson Cooper's show. It's just a ridiculous. Well, ridiculous.
Don't bother breaking our eardrums with that. But look, I mean, this is just a desperation on their part. They have no other argument. Even when they say, oh, yeah, Trish, well, these are Putin's talking points. They're not even addressing why they're Putin's talking points. Are they Putin's talking points because they're true and convincing? Because they might be. The fact that the Russians have the same argument that I have when I explain what their point of view must be. Yeah, well, because that's the world that we're living in. That's why. These aren't lies. It's a fact that Joe Biden himself overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. There's a clip you could play. In fact, I have it here if I could get my audio player to open quickly enough for you.
Who is it? Who is it a clip of?
It's Victoria Nuland
Yeah.
telling Jeffrey Pyatt that I just got off the phone with Jake Sullivan, and he confirms to me that the vice president is down to help us pull it off. And in fact, I can get it right here somewhere. Let me see.
If you've got it, play it. I've used it on the show before, but that was ages ago. If you've got it, definitely pull it up. I know the one you're talking about.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
There you go.
So just break down what exactly she is saying there.
Well, so the whole discussion is about a regime change in Ukraine and how once they're done accomplishing the putsch, that these are the people they're going to put in power. And this is the need, especially Pyatt emphasizes their need to hurry up and get this thing nailed down before Putin has a chance to react. We have to glue this thing. We have to midwife this thing. We have to make it sail before Putin can torpedo it. This kind of language. And what she's saying there, and this is the famous F the EU phone call. Yes. And the point is that she's saying F the EU because the Germans are taking too long to do this coup, or they don't even want to. They kind of want to compromise and get in our way. So F the EU. Instead, what we'll do is we will go to this guy, Robert Seri, that we have at the UN, and we'll just work through him. And essentially, I believe that this is, directly related to what became the ultimatum that was delivered to Yanukovych, and it was even on video where I believe it was a German minister, it was definitely an EU minister, was caught on tape telling Yanukovych, you better sign this thing or you're dead, pal. And that was when he signed the deal. And then that deal meant he would promise to pull back his police from the Maidan, and the protesters would agree to go home, and they would hold new elections in a couple of months. Well, of course, he pulled his police back, and then the demonstrators simply seized the buildings and accomplished the putsch. The first thing they did was put up a bunch of white supremacist banners inside the city hall there. And it was the C-14 in the right sector who had done the putsch. And so in that clip, though, she's saying, I just got off the VFR, or whatever, I guess, private email server, whatever she's talking about there exactly. Just talked with Sullivan, that is currently America's Joe Biden's national security advisor, President Joe Biden's national security advisor. He
Jake
was
Sullivan.
then Vice President Biden's national security advisor. Before that, he had been Hillary Clinton's right-hand man, her Cheney. And he's the guy who wrote the famous email about, you are so wonderful because you did such a great job overthrowing Libya, and you're going to go down in history as the overthrower of Libya, you wonderful lady. And he's the same guy who wrote her an email that said, hey, look, AQ is on our side in Syria, which was from the very beginning of 2012 when Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, urged all good Muslims to go to Syria to help overthrow Assad. And so he wasn't being cheeky, he was saying, haha, like, isn't this ironic or whatever. He was not saying, oh my God, Madam Secretary, I think maybe we're kind of lining up with some forces that we better be careful what we're doing here. Instead, he's just like, he, look at what we're getting away with, essentially. And so that's the guy. And she's saying, I just got off the phone with Sullivan. Sullivan says we're going to need Biden. So I say, yes, we're going to do that. We're going to put him on a conference call with the principals of the plot, the Ukrainians, she's obviously referring to give them an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. In other words, we want Biden to be the one on the phone to say, you're going to be the prime minister, you're going to be the PR man, and you're going to run the House of Representatives and the whatever, right? I mean, take the Speaker of the Parliament spot. That would have been Andrew Perubi, the Nazi. And so that was what they were talking about. They're plotting a coup d'etat. And amazingly, presumably the Russians, I guess it could have been Yanukovych's government, but presumably the Russians intercepted this phone call put it on YouTube where everybody could hear it. The BBC and the New York Times and everybody reported on it because they absolutely had to. But then what did they do? They said, oh my goodness, a diplomat used the F word in a private phone call. Why, that's not diplomatic at all. Ma'am, do you apologize for using a bad word? And she says, yes, I do. And they gave her every opportunity to deny what was in there, and she did not deny what was in there. She did not claim that it had been edited in any way. And in fact, it was funny because I had like a pro-Democrat truther type trying to spin this whole thing away, that the whole thing was fake somehow, or, you know, okay, well, she admitted that some of it was true when she apologized for the F word, but she doesn't say here whether it was edited or not. And then we found where she verified, no, she actually did verify that every bit of it is true. She does not dispute any of the content of the phone call. She does not claim it was edited out of context or any other thing. It was 100% rubber stamp verified by Newland herself to be completely legit. So they're caught red-handed. And then 2 weeks later, they do the GD coup anyway. And they got away with it somehow anyway, which is just incredible.
Well, the other interesting thing about what you're saying, as I just going back to my earlier comment, is that this history of Ukraine, I mean, it's astonishing that legacy media is covering this like Ukraine was an organically happening democracy before Putin invaded. I mean, it's all performative, right? It's all theater now. You can't even, like, I know there's always propaganda before a war. I've been around for a few decades. I've covered it. I marched against the Iraq war. You know, I believed Scott Ritter. I mean, that's like par for the course, but this is a new level for me. And they're not even trying to report the facts. They're not even pretending that these crazy propaganda stories that have come out, you know, about the people who were shot for telling the Russian soldiers to F off. I mean, just like ridiculous stuff. Well, and the frightening thing about it, I believe, Scott, is that they now know that there has been a kind of an informational coup, right? Like never, I think in the history, in contemporary history anyway, has there been a democracy that will survive in any way, shape, or form with the legacy media as corrupt as we're seeing now. And we're at the brink of a nuclear war now, in my view, because of that.
I think that's right. I mean, look, I mean, this was the thing 20 years ago, too. It was. And I marched in the February and March 15th protests here in Austin. There are 50,000 people in Austin, Texas, which is obviously a liberal government employee town, university town. But still, there are some right-wingers there, too. And there are a lot of people who just knew better than
absolutely
to do what we're doing. And yet, I mean, all of us at that time felt the same way about it. It was on one side of the argument was, we can't believe you America-hating, wimpy, sissy commies would just lay down before our enemies like Saddam Hussein and let him attack us and not respond. You commie simp traitors. And then everyone else going, no, you idiot, Saddam didn't do it. It's just that you're stupid.
Yeah.
Right? And that was the argument. Commie simp traitor versus you don't know what the F you're talking about, man. And that's the same thing here. Oh, you're on the side of Putin. Actually, you don't know the first thing about it. It's the same conversation. And the people who are the most certain are the people who know the least. Because anybody who knows anything about any subject, frankly, knows that there's a lot of nuance here. Anybody who knows, I mean, if you go look at Reddit, where the Democratic centrist consensus is enforced, everybody knows that essentially the White House party line, the CNN party line of the day, every day is the absolute truth. And anybody who disagrees with that is so stupid and such a Russian talking point repeating agent. Oh, did you know that on Russian TV, they said something nice about Tulsi Gabbard? Therefore, if she says anything about Russia, we should not listen to it. And just, we're talking about American grown adults. This is who we are. There's a George Carlinian rant here. This is the best we can do, folks. This is us. This is our schools. This is our churches. These are our fathers and mothers. Not mine, but everybody else's, I guess. 20 years ago, my nephew asked me, Uncle Scott, you tell me that this war is totally wrong and that George Bush is terrible. But all of my teachers and all of the grown-ups at church and all of my friends' parents, they all love him and say that he's great and protecting us. So he looks at me all skeptical. What's wrong with them? I love this kid. So I said, well, they're stupid. That's what's wrong with them. And, which isn't the best answer, but it sort of is, right? The answer is your teacher at government school doesn't know the first thing about the Middle East at all. She doesn't know who he's killing. All she knows is she likes him and trusts him and presumes that he wouldn't do a wrong thing because that would be the wrong thing to do. And so whatever he's doing must be great. In other words, she's stupid. And so are all your friends' parents too. They're stupid. They can't tell the guy with the mustache from the guy with the beard because they're stupid. They can't tell a Saudi exile hiding in no man's land in Pakistan on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan from the secular Iraqi commie dictator that worked for the United States for 10 years before we betrayed him. Because they don't know anything about it, but they're willing to support this ultra violence. Millions killed in the terror wars. 1 million in Iraq War II alone.
Yeah.
Because they like him and trust him and he passed their little beer test and what have you. So that's how it is. And many of them, doesn't he look like a bad guy out of a movie? Don't tell me you're on the side of the bad guy in this whole morality play we're all having fun engaging in. And so that's as far as the argument goes. Nobody has to know anything about Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump's and Biden's provocations against the Russians. Nobody has to know that 1 year ago, the Biden government was bringing the Ukrainian government to D.C. and lavishing them with all these promises of future membership in NATO and war guarantees and weapons sales and all the rest of this. That was how the Biden government spent September and October leading up to the beginning of the Russian buildup of forces before the invasion. It was Joe Biden, the same guy who'd done the coup. Go look it up. It was the beginning of September. He brings Zelensky to D.C. 1 year ago. 1 year and, a month and a half ago now. And it was all, and then through November, they kept, I forget the title of it, but they issued their new proclamation of cooperation and intention to bring them into NATO as soon as possible. It's all there. It's all in Reuters. So look it up.
Do you think that they were deliberately provoking what's happening now? I mean, or are they just stupid? I mean, they are stupid, but
okay. There's a not very nuanced answer to this. I mean, I think the real answer is no. They want to get away with everything. It's the same thing that Newland and Pyatt talk about. We don't want Putin to react. We want to get away with this easy. Of course, then they turn around, lose Crimea, and a giant war breaks out in the East, and get away with anything. But that's what I think they're trying to do. In the case of last year, I think what they were doing was telling Putin that we're going to have our way and you better not try it. But that was it. That was as far as they were willing to negotiate, was to warn him that there will be real problems for you if you do. But as Derek Chollet, who is from Biden's National Security Council, happily admitted to, not critically, happily admitted to war on the rocks, they refused to negotiate over NATO membership for Ukraine at all. And, Biden had said, come on, we don't mean to bring Ukraine into NATO anytime in the next 10 years anyway. So what's the big deal? And I had hoped and thought that would be enough, that Putin's not going to start a war when he knows that that's probably really right. But, Putin's calculation, I think, was different. It was more like they're at the point of no return where they're already de facto members. So if you don't back off now, this is already over the line. And they weren't willing to negotiate in good faith. And so I think if you go back and look at last December and January and February, you see a lot of warnings, but no real attempt to negotiate. And it's really unfortunate because I think Biden didn't want this war personally. A lot of his government did, but he was somewhat conciliatory in the December 30th speech. Obviously they had decided where their lines were, where they were going to go with it. but, he said something like, come on. If you want to inspect our missile launchers in Poland, that's cool. We're not putting Tomahawk cruise missiles in there because that is a real concern. They're dual use launchers. Those Mark 41 missile launchers can be used to hold Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be tipped with H-bombs. And so the Russians had complained about this for years since W. Bush, that, come on, man, we have to take this as a credible threat. So Biden said, look, we can have inspections there. That was one of his counter proposals. We can have it. So I don't know. In other words, they were willing to negotiate on some things, but not enough. And
you know what?
Frankly, I don't think that the Russians' demands were out of bounds. They said, sorry, one more thing. They said, the Russians said, we want you to live up to the promise of 1997. We're going to put all your forces in Eastern Europe back where they were in 97. And people treated this like this was absolutely crazy, like he was demanding a ransom of $1 billion, like Mike Myers in the thingamajig or something, But no, this was Bill Clinton's sworn sacred oath. Look, man, I'm not going to put it in writing. This is how it happened. I won't put it in writing. We're not doing a treaty and we're not doing an official agreement. But I swear before baby Jesus, we are not going to put any of our military assets into the new members of NATO in Eastern Europe. We're going to bring them in, but we're not going to move our military equipment over there. And people acted like 1997 was 1907, and no promise from them means a damn thing. And that Putin was a madman for saying you should take your equipment back to Germany. Why does America need a base in Poland? It was only Trump that put a permanent base in Poland. Obama and Bush didn't. So why is it now sacred obligation that we have to have a permanent base in Poland? We don't. They say we have this open door policy. Any country in Europe can join NATO. And it's this door that we have, and it's open, and no one can close it. And the Russians can never close our open door. This is completely made up. There's no door. There's no door. And the Russians aren't closing a door. The Russians, just forget all this metaphorical talk. What are we saying here? We're saying this country that's nowhere near the North Atlantic, that is historically part of Russia and has been dominated by them for 300 years, 250 at least, that this is our doorstep and our sphere of influence, but it's not theirs, and that we're willing to go to war for that. That's what we're talking about. And they always want to break off into this silly language so that they don't have to define what they're really saying, And so, I mean, I don't know.
And I don't know how you move past either is this framing that the media has bought, because they've been told to the idea that anything but total war means you're appeasing, like Neville Chamberlain, which is, a ridiculous idea, but they push it. And people, I hear from people in my Twitter, people DM me saying, what are we supposed to do? Appease this guy when it's really, really frustrating how easily people are led by these fake narratives, right?
Yeah, it's just a cliche, right? I mean, why is it that the narrative isn't, how long should the Russians continue to appease the United States? Maybe America's the bully. America, the same government that murdered or got murdered 2 million people, conservative estimate, in the last 20 years in the Middle East. Throwing our soldiers into these meat grinders and then don't even say a word about them now. The terror wars, that was back before Vietnam or something. That's old, ancient history.
Nobody talks about it. And you know what the biggest, the most, I think the most important political statements being made by anybody these days are the commercials for the Tunnel to Towers build homes for mutilated veterans that appear in the evening news, because it's I don't think they intended it this way, but they show these young men who are literally quadruple amputees from Iraq and Afghanistan cheering because this organization is building them handicapped level housing, right, for them. And for me, it's as someone who covered the Iraq War quite intensely, I worked for Bobby Mueller at Vietnam Veterans Against the War for a couple of years during the height of the Iraq War. And it's the best kind of purifying reminder of what's really at stake here, right? It's not the la la land cliches about Neville Chamberlain. It is, are you prepared to let your husband, son, father, daughter, whatever, return from the battlefield so fundamentally changed for something that has no meritorious reason?
Right. And look, all those organizations that you're talking about that advertise on the cable news channels for help out a veteran, does anyone listening to this believe that anyone in Northern Virginia or Southern Maryland, DC area has anything to do with that at all? No. The people living in all those McMansions that they bought with tax money for being part of the new military and homeland security industrial complex on the back of the terror war, on the back of those men, they're not the ones who care. It's all people out in the country, other veterans and their families who are behind those organizations trying to raise money to help those people.
Well, I think it was
the ones who sent them to war don't give a damn about these men and women at all.
No, they don't. The other interesting thing for me about these kind of injuries, when I was living and working in DC, I found out from a reporter that I was working with on some of this stuff that they were bringing in the guys and women from Landstuhl in buses and caravan trucks with blacked out windows. So they would pick up these catastrophically wounded, very young kids and take them to Walter Reed in the dead of night in these vans with blacked out windows, And we went down there one night. He called me and said, Trish, they're doing this. And I said, oh, come on. Why would they sneakily bring them in? And he said, no, we went down there one night and you could see what they were doing. It was a big old secret that these guys, and that was before, remember in the early days of the Iraq War, they didn't really talk about anything like that, about who was being wounded and what.
Well, there was the Dover test. The Dover test was, look, when American GIs come home dead in flag-draped coffins, they land at Dover Air Force Base, and the media can take pictures and video of that, and it goes up on the news. Now, if the American people can remain behind a war while the bodies keep coming home, then the war has passed the Dover test as far as the American so-called democracy's willingness to continue whatever it is our government says we have to do here. So then what do? They just ban the cameras.
Yeah.
And they canceled the Dover test as a test because they knew they couldn't pass it. They knew that they wouldn't be able to get past this, fall of 2003 if they had to continue to show all the guys coming home blown up from that war. And so they just stopped it. They canceled the test. It's like a government school, skills test. Like, well, we got to redo it because everybody's flunking it.
Yeah. Well, the other interesting thing about that war for me, and I guess Afghanistan too, was because they were insurgent, the weapon, it was no mano shooting at each other. It was all explosions, right? So the IEDs and suicide bombers. And I actually interviewed a guy who was the mortuary affairs dude for the Marine Corps that was serving the area near Fallujah. And he just come back. He was completely traumatized, just a mess, lovely guy. And he gave me this soliloquy about what serving in that environment was about, right? And one of the things a story he told was about they had to go and get the remains after some kind of an IED had blown up, maybe a Humvee or something. And everybody was in tiny little pieces. And the Marine Corps, of course, they don't leave not even a fingernail behind, right? They move through their forensically collecting all of these body parts that they then returned to the family in a casket of some sort. And he said we had to put a flag near every body part to show where we'd found things and then take the picture. And he said, when I took the picture, I realized there were hundreds and hundreds of little flags in the ground showing, a part of these 5 guys who'd been blown up, right? I mean, it's just, those are things that you can't get over in life. And you certainly cannot get over them if the war was misbegotten and a lie. And that's what happened to these guys, right? I think you cannot be too graphic about what they experienced.
I mean, Joe Biden was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in 2002 rubber stamping this war. The opposition party ruled the upper house. He could have stopped this war. And instead, he was Bush and Cheney's whip, making sure that Hillary and Kerry and Gephardt and whoever towed the line and supported the thing. And he'd been a hawk on Iraq for years before that. And, this is part of his whole thing. His whole career was essentially supporting that, voting for all the appropriations to continue it. I think he might have opposed the surge by 2007, but too little too late by then anyway. And
it's all hidden, isn't it? It kind of reminded me, those experiences I had being in DC while this was going on, it reminded me of Gloria Emerson's book, Winners and Losers, where she describes a family whose kid was returned with some pretty significant issues and nobody recognized it. Nobody would talk about it. They would sit at dinner and nobody could discuss what had actually happened to this boy. And it felt kind of the same, that the country moves on. The Walmarts are busy. The highways are full of traffic. People are going to work and getting married. And these really catastrophic things are happening to lovely young American kids. Yeah. And nobody's paying attention. And I think that drives PTSD too. I think it's really hard to come home to a country that's forgotten you ever served, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And of course, oh man, I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something brilliant there. Believe me,
I'm sure it was
going to be great if I was only smart enough to remember what it was.
Well, I was talking about the world going on while these kids are over there in a hellhole.
I remember now. It was, and this was part of where I was going with, Biden's role in getting us into Iraq and expanding the whole terror war. Was his people told the New York Times back when the war in Ukraine was starting that, look, the terror wars have been real bad. But so this is our redemption. By pouring all these weapons into Ukraine and helping the smaller, weaker force defend themselves from the bigger force, that makes us back on the side of the angels. And this is how we forgive ourselves for Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia and Libya and Syria and Yemen and all the 2 million dead, is we get another few 100,000 people killed, but this time on the right side. And, they really said, I got the quote somewhere in my notes, like, this is our absolution. This is our American, government employee sacrament, is we spill blood now in one direction instead of the other, in a way that makes us feel good about ourselves for the blood that we spilled the last time in the wrong direction.
That certainly.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it certainly explains the framing, doesn't it?
Yeah. And look, I mean, this is what happened in Syria, right? We put the Ayatollah's best friends in power in Iraq. So now we have to make up for that by doing the right thing, by helping the Sunnis overthrow the Shiites in Syria. But that means bin Laden and his guys. It means Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. That's who we're supporting. Oh, that wasn't right. Oh, no, look what happened. It turned into the Islamic State Caliphate, with might as well be bin Laden himself, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, up there on the balcony like Mussolini, declaring himself the dictator. So now what do we got to do? Now we got to put ourselves back on the side of the angels, meaning General Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC, who's leading the effort of the Shiite militias that we wish we hadn't fought Iraq War II for. Now we're going to fly as their Air Force against the Islamic State that we built to spite them, because it turned into such a big thing. Now we got to put ourselves back on the angels, on the side of the angels, the Shiites. But then, of course, that makes all of our Sunni allies so mad. So then they're like, all right, look, if we're tilting back toward the Shiites against the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, well, you at least got to give us a genocide in Yemen. And so they turn around and take the side of Al-Qaeda again down there in a war that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. Yeah. All of this is, in fact, even you can find justifications for invading Iraq where they said, look, Bush Sr. encouraged the Shiite uprising and left those poor people high and dry. It's time for us to do them justice and help them, the supermajority Shiite population of Iraq, win their regime change and overthrow Saddam and create a wonderful democracy. And so all they ever do is make up for their terrible mistakes and absolve themselves and fix it by moving on to the next stage of the war. That's all they've done. That's what Enough Already, my book Enough Already, is about, is all this. You go to I do start in 79, aka 53, with the Iranian coup, but then especially just go from Jimmy Carter's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, his support for Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran, and announcing of the Carter Doctrine in the Middle East, and just go from there. And then it's all nothing but cause and effect all the way through. The president's interchangeable. I'm no partisan. The two presidents I hate the most, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. It's not a partisan thing. It's just, well, there are things about them that I hate the most. But anyway, they're the ones who did the most damage in my eyes.
Yeah, no, and they've kind of divided up along those lines. I have to get to your book, Hotter Than the Sun, which is about abolishing nuclear weapons, which I completely agree with. But you mentioned Trump, and I know he's a controversial, hot button figure for people. He was super flawed, et cetera, et cetera. But when I was working on my Iraq book, he was publicly saying things about the war in Iraq that I thought were really smart. And he did seem, despite all of his other shystery stuff, to want to end what Tulsi Gabbard calls the regime change wars in America. And yet, he failed at that. Did he fail because he is weak and was led by bad people? Or, I mean, how do you explain? Because at the beginning of his presidency, he seemed pretty committed to that idea. And maybe it's just something you can't win when you're in that office. But I'd like your take on that.
Well, as I like to say, we needed Ron Paul and we got Rudy Giuliani. Yeah. Basically. Yeah. And that's who Donald Trump is. That's his best buddy for years. That's essentially his point of view. And you got to understand about Trump. Well, there's a few things that I think people already understand about Trump. Think back to the Trump you knew before he was ever the president. And that's who we're talking about here. It's Donald Trump, man. So the guy ain't that deep. He's got reactions and emotions just like everybody. So he looked at the war in Afghanistan and he goes, this is a horrible waste. What are we doing? Our guys are getting their legs blown off. We're going to lose this thing anyway. We're fighting for women's rights in the town of Bedrock. As far as you could get from here without being on your way back again. This ancient culture that's not giving in. A warrior culture of people who refuse to be pacified. Why are we doing this? Well, he was, of course, absolutely right about that. Every part of the reality of Afghanistan that he could observe reinforced his inclination that this is stupid. But if you turn around and tell him, Iran, 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 he'll go, oh, Iran. And so, in reality, Iran ain't much more powerful than the Taliban compared to American power. And if Donald Trump wanted to just invite the Ayatollah to D.C. or hop on a plane to Tehran and shake his hand and make a deal, we don't have to tilt back toward Iran and bring them into our military alliance system or anything, but we could get along with them. Ronald Reagan sold the missiles just a couple of years after they had blown up or sponsored the militia that blown up our guys in Beirut. The Israelis were selling them weapons all the way through up until the mid-90s, or like 93. So,
But let me just say one more thing about Trump, and then I want to move into the nuclear question. But the other thing that seemed to be made clear during the years that he was president, he did seem to legitimately be trying for some form of loose détente with Putin, right? He did, and he was criticized for that. And
I was going to say, what happened was he said way too many times in the campaign how this was one of his major priorities. Yeah. And they completely went nuts. And then Hillary and her people got the great idea that they would frame him for treason. And they framed him. And for everyone who doesn't know, and look, I'm a libertarian, and you guys can tell I'm just not a partisan here. I'm just not. The fact of the matter is that whole Russiagate thing, all of it was a lie. Every bit of it. Even the Facebook ads that they bought, that was just clickbait for money. It had nothing to do with disrupting anything. The whole thing was made up first by the Democrats and then very quickly in league with the FBI's counterintelligence division and the CIA. And they came up with 1,000 points of crap, just like any prison planet conspiracy theory, right? Is you can build a case for anything, but none of it was true. And it was, but 100 lies, 1,000 lies, all combined to be enough for people to believe in if they wanted to believe in it in typical conspiratoid fashion, right? Is exactly what happened there. But in doing so, they put Trump in a position where he's just this two-dimensional character. So what does he do? Does he invite Putin to D.C. and say, nuts to all of you guys, I'm declassifying everything about me and Russia, and all of you prosecutors are fired, and I'm signing a brand new nuclear treaty with Russia and a brand new understanding of cooperation between Russia and NATO, because that's what's most important. And Henry Kissinger himself told me it was the smart and right thing to do, so screw you guys. Did he do that? No. Instead, what did he do? He said, his own son said, look at all the weapons we're pouring into Ukraine. That proves that we're not Russian agents. Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for starting World War III, jerk. Because
I'm with you. Look, and what else he did was hire John Bolton. He brought in John Bolton.
Sure. And look, I think it's reasonable to conclude that Donald Trump was as blackmailed by Mossad for his connections with Epstein as Bill Clinton or any other person there. And
you think so?
He didn't need Sheldon Adelson's money.
Yeah.
Right? He had the New York Times went through his taxes, says he has like $7 billion, if not 10. He could have financed the entire Republican Party, House, Senate, and himself by himself and not even miss it. Made it back in investments in a year's time or less, right? It would have been nothing. A few $100 million is nothing to a guy with $7 billion. And yet he's willing to let Sheldon Adelson pick his national security advisor. And it's a guy who's obviously, been an agent of influence for Israel for many years.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a shame because I thought there was a moment there. I really believed that there could be a moment. And just before we go to nukes, what's your response to Tulsi Gabbard walking away from the Dems?
Well, I like and respect her, but I don't ever really exactly know what she's up to. If she's going to run as a Republican in the primary, she's going to have to get good on guns and some other things.
Yeah.
She's got some explaining to do, but Republicans like her. And I think she's being genuine in her disgust with all the woke stuff and with the center left liberal foreign policy, which is just absolutely as demented as Bill Kristol could be type of a way of looking at things. So, I really respect her for that.
Yeah.
I think, when it comes to the terror wars, I have to say, she is always against the war for terrorism. In other words, we should not be taking the side of Al-Qaeda in Libya, Syria, or Yemen. She's very consistent about that. She's also very consistent that we should be at war against Al-Qaeda wherever they are in the world forever. And that is a huge loophole for Middle Eastern intervention that could lead to regime change for the next president after her anyway, because there's always going to be a Sunni with a rifle, whether they're being backed by the CIA and Saudis at that moment or not. Usually they are. That can serve as an excuse for a lot of intervention. So I've been critical of her on that. I think truly the best way to wrap up the war on terrorism is to, first of all, stop backing them, and then cease intervention in the Middle East and let those nation states shore up their own authority at the jihadis' expense. And I don't think there's much of a threat when you're really talking about stateless actors other than their support by Saudi intelligence and American intelligence for them, and Turks too. But
let me ask you this, Scott, because the name of your organization is antiwar.com. And I guess this is maybe too simplistic of a question, but are you against war generally, any war? Or is there, as they say, a good war or a moral war possible in your view?
Well, yeah, I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a religious guy, and I don't have an ideology of, I'm a libertarian. So we believe in armed peace, right? In fact, even our position on guns is pretty much mutually assured destruction. Let every man be armed so the government can't even think about turning this into the kind of fascist state that they would like to turn it into, because they just do not have the manpower or the firepower to take on the male population of the nation, which is at the end of the day what it comes down to. That was what I was raised to believe, even by liberal Democrats, was that the Second Amendment is so that every man can have a rifle for the day that never comes, right? And that if your government ever came to take everybody's rifles, then that would be the government you use your rifle against. But until that day, no. And that day ain't coming, because of how well armed people are in the first place. And so that's very much, the libertarian take. Well, of course, libertarians believe in self-defense on an individual basis too. But so look, I think, there was a quote from a general from Japan. I forgot which one it was. I don't think it was Tojo. It was somebody or another. Says, somebody asked him, so you guys were ready to invade California, huh? Because that's what FDR told me, derp. And he says, are you kidding me? There would have been a rifle behind every blade of grass. In other words, how the hell are they supposed to get past Long Beach? Right? When the people of LA come with their guns, you're not going anywhere. So, I think, and frankly, theoretically in other people's nations over there in Eurasia, all those borders are drawn in the wrong places, more or less, by foreign powers. And there's a hell of a lot of peace treaties and negotiations to be worked out in order to solve a lot of those problems. But here, we have two weak and friendly neighbors, two vast oceans. And as Ron Paul told the Washington Post in 2008, we could defend this country with a couple of good submarines. There's no and quite frankly, one submarine could kill all of Eurasia. You understand that? One submarine can hold 24 missiles, each with multiple re-entry vehicles, which I'm not sure exactly how many, up to 8 or 10 each. That's enough to just kill everything. One sub is enough to to cause nuclear winter and starve billions. So yeah, we certainly could deter any attack on the United States of America. With a couple of good submarines, we'd be fine. We don't even need a standing army, period, in this country. We don't need this militarism and this intervention overseas. And you know what? Quite frankly, not to be too visionary about it, but what if America wasn't a blood-soaked hypocrite with a dog in everybody else's hunt all around the world? What if we really weren't? Really weren't? Not just public relations. Then we could host the peace conferences. And then, like Switzerland does. And we wouldn't be making promises of what we are going to do for you, that kind of thing. But we could say, look, we've got the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Chinese, and the poor Kashmiris who all have a real interest in the future of Kashmir. And we have all 7.5 billion of us on this planet, going on 8, who have an interest in preventing nuclear war, especially over a silly land claim in the Himalayas somewhere. We have to work this out. Let's figure out who's willing to compromise on what until we can get some signatures on this thing. And we can play that role all over the world. What are we going to do about Transnistria? This little strip of pro-Russian land, this breakaway former vacation spot during the Soviet Union that's now full of Russians, in the land between Moldova and Ukraine. That's pretty inconvenient, isn't it? Well, maybe somebody needs to come up with something brilliant. But America obviously cannot be involved in that now, can we? Since America is absolutely on the side of the Western Ukrainians in their war against the Russians, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a million examples like that all over the world.
Well, we're doing the same thing here, Scott. Canada, as you well know, Canada, we stayed out of Vietnam, we stayed out of Iraq, and as Canadian citizens, we were quite proud. And I think rightly so, of our peacekeeping reputation. But our current globalist prime minister is all in on Ukraine now. His rhetoric is almost as bad as Biden's is. So that's kind of disheartening. But let me we're going to move to nukes now because we're running out of time. But I rewatched If You Love This Planet with Helen Caldicott. A story I'm old enough and have been around long enough that I did a story on that film when it first came out in the 70s, late 70s. And I think it really stands the test of time and probably should be shown in every school again, because we are sleepwalking into something that I really feel that these sort of young news people are they're throwing the term nuclear war around like it's kind of meaningless, something that we can do and get beyond. So let's talk about that. There was a former Joint Chiefs General yesterday, I believe, who said we got to stop this rhetoric and crank it down a bit here. But what is your fear about what we're doing now?
Well, I think I'm not really sure the extent of people's knowledge or ignorance about nuclear weapons. I guess it's probably safe to say most people don't understand very much about them. If you've ever seen a photo of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or in fact, the Trinity test, that first plutonium bomb that they tested in New Mexico, something like that. You have to understand, well, forget Hiroshima. That's sort of a different story. But the Nagasaki bomb or that Trinity test bomb, that's the blasting cap for detonating a thermonuclear weapon. So, you know, on Back to the Future 2, or I guess it's at the end of Back to the Future 1, he's got Mr. Fusion on the back of the DeLorean, cold fusion. He just throws banana peels and whatever in there, and somehow they get limitless free energy out of it because they're fusing atoms together, which causes a great release of energy. And somehow in the Back to the Future, they figured out how to do this at room temperature. Okay. In our real world, so far, we don't have cold fusion. The only way to fuse atoms together, you got to make it hotter than the sun first. And then at that excited state, you can fuse atoms together. So an atom bomb is when you split apart uranium, or especially usually plutonium atoms, these heavy metal radioactive atoms. You split those apart, and that releases in a chain reaction a Nagasaki type explosion, which that alone killed 75,000 people instantly and decimated the city. But that then makes it hot enough that you can fuse isotopes of hydrogen, essentially our lightest atom, right? You fuse those together at that heat, and that releases far, far more energy. And that's what we call a thermonuclear weapon or a hydrogen bomb. So, for example, if you go look at nuclear bombs on YouTube, anything that you see that they're testing in Nevada, that's an atom bomb. When you see them testing bombs out in the Pacific Ocean, those are the hydrogen bombs. And you can see how even just 1 or 2 megatons, which is, I'm sorry, I forget all the calculations, how many thousand times a Hiroshima bomb. But, you know, they made them, the biggest Russian one ever was 50 megatons. The Americans tested some that were, and I think 20 and 30 megaton ranges. But 1 or 2 megatons is enough to kill all of Houston, Texas. Just one bomb is enough to destroy, to wipe Dallas off the face of the earth.
Buildings too, right? Buildings too?
Sorry?
Buildings too?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We're talking absolute devastation. So people who are familiar with Los Angeles, let's say that somebody detonated one over East Hollywood, right? That would blow up everything from the sea to downtown would be dead, right? And down to, you know, all of Compton and all of, you know, South LA too, all the way down to, you know, Seal Beach or wherever down there, way, way down there. It would just kill everybody. It would kill millions of people. That's just a couple of megatons. If you've seen Terminator 2 or Nightmare, that's what it would look like if you nuked LA right there. That is a pretty fair depiction of what it would look like. And there is no defense against this. The only defense against incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles is outgoing nukes to meet them in space with what they call neutron bombs, an enhanced radiation device that explodes more as radiation than heat in order to try to knock out the avionics and the electronics of the incoming nukes. Well, guess what? We don't have those. America does not have in our arsenal enhanced radiation neutron bombs for taking out incoming Russian nukes in space. Our anti-missile systems are meant to take out 1 or 2 ICBMs at a time. Say if North Korea tried, then we would try to shoot them down. It probably wouldn't even work anyway. We would try to shoot down if North Korea launched 1 or 2 missiles at us. If the Russians launch their salvos at us, we're done. There is no defense from them. There is no defense for them either. It would be the loss of all of our biggest military bases and many of our biggest and most important cities. It would be essentially equivalent to how many people died in World War II in a single afternoon. 60 million people, something like that, would be the first day of a real thermonuclear exchange in a general nuclear war between America and Russia. And you have to understand, too, that once it starts, it's so hard to back down And this is just the same with the war on terrorism or the war in Vietnam or any of these stupid things. We stop talking about the national interest. We start talking about what is good for the politicians sitting in the chair right now. For example, if the Chinese sank an aircraft carrier in a dispute over Taiwan, what would Biden do? The question is, would he rather die and kill us all than say, you know what, America, we're just going to have to take this one on the chin? Because, damn it, I shouldn't have sailed that boat so close.
He would do the
My
former.
bad.
He would do the former. He would do the
Right.
former.
So that's
right?
the same as essentially any politician. Same as any politician in Russia or any politician in China. People act like mutually assured destruction is this magic wish that guarantees there can be no war. But that's not true. It's just a good deterrent. But it's one that if it fails, it means the death of us all. And by the way, one more thing. When people hear about nuclear winter, maybe that sounds unreal. Like we're saying, or the scientists are saying, that temperatures would plunge by 20, 30, 40 degrees. We'd have blizzards in July and whatever. I don't think that that's what you need to necessarily picture in your mind as like this sort of argument ad absurdum. How about just global temperatures drop by 5 or 10 degrees for a few years? In other words, the sun doesn't come out in the spring or the summer for a few years in a row. What that means then is the 8 billion of us starve. The people of Earth starve. Everyone who wasn't blown up, the crops fail. So you have very small sustenance farming, but everyone who's dependent on this vast interwoven system of global capitalism and exchange and trade in foodstuffs that keep Paris fed, as Bastiat said, every night. All of that would be broken. All of it would be broken. And so whoever's got the canned goods and underground bunker, great. For the other, 8 billion people in the world are going to lay down and die. It would be, as I'm not sure who coined the phrase, Daniel Ellsberg in his book calls it omnicide, the murder of the entire human species. And once the Russians start launching nukes at us, or we start launching nukes at them, then the idea is, well, we have to launch everything we've got because it's use them or lose them. The first thing they're going to target is our nuclear silos. First thing they're going to target is our submarine pens. First thing they're going to target is our strategic air command, which means we got to launch everything we've got before they hit everything we've got. But that's their policy too. And that means through the first and the second waves of strikes and retaliation, we're all dead. There's only 1 or 2 binders on the shelf for how to fight a war, and they all go to general nuclear war. Imagine if Moscow nuked New York. Would we sit there and take it? But even if we know that if we nuke Moscow back, they're going to launch everything we got.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have to launch everything they got. But our alternative is to say, oh, well, I guess they got one over on us. Right? So, yeah, in other words, that wouldn't happen. Not just Joe Biden, but the American people probably wouldn't tolerate that, right? Any more than the North would tolerate the South firing on Fort Sumter. It's on now. And if that means H-bombs, so be it. And people should not believe that this is impossible. And I'm not saying this is going to happen. But I am warning you that this is as close as we've been to nuclear war maybe ever. Right there on the same ladder with 1962. But I have to tell you, I know a thing or two about 1962 and that Cuban Missile Crisis. And the lesson from that was you can't get closer to nuclear war than that without having it. That is it. As they call it, the absolute brink. And we are dangerously close to that line right now. We have a president of Russia who, as Pat Buchanan so aptly put it, has just raised the ante on a bad hand by formally signing and annexing these 4 eastern provinces of Ukraine. This essentially, with semantics and the stroke of a pen, has massively escalated the Russian stake in this war. He said all along he's willing to use nukes to defend Russia. And now he's just extended Russia's official borders, according to him, by a few hundred miles to the west. And he's saying And which, of course, means the Ukrainians and our American and NATO allies don't recognize that at all and say, nope, that's still Ukraine, and we're still fighting for it. In other words, just through language, he has now ratcheted up the stakes in this war massively to the degree and has threatened specifically to use nuclear weapons to enforce it. If it came down to it, he said the precedent was set at Hiroshima. And what do the Americans say about Hiroshima, too? Ask them every August when Hiroshima Day comes around, never mind Nagasaki. When Hiroshima Day comes around, what do they all say? We did this to end the war quicker.
Yeah.
Does anybody think that would be an okay excuse for Putin to use right now? To nuke Kiev and say, I did it to end the war quicker, just like Harry Truman?
Yeah, I remember one thing Helen Caldicott says in that presentation, and it occurred to me as you were speaking about the devastation, and that is that after a nuclear explosion, the living will envy the dead. And that certainly stuck with me.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, if I got time to rant for a minute here.
Sure.
Well, imagine then that the 50 or so biggest cities in America are nuked. And we got a lot of cities that aren't nuked, a lot of towns that aren't nuked. We do have a vast country full of resources. So you'd have a hell of a lot of refugees. But, you know, I don't know if it would absolutely be like Night of the Living Dead zombie hordes. You know, I think Americans are very charitable and friendly people and take care of each other as much as possible.
Agreed.
But then again, through nuclear winter and the ultimate starvation, through all the radiation sickness and the fallout, and all the martial law and all the violence over food resources and so forth. You know, my grandfather used to say, I usually don't talk about my family. My grandfather used to say, I hope the first one lands right on my head. If they do have it, then let's go ahead and get me over with and out of here.
Me too.
I don't want to see it.
I'm with your grandpa. I'm with him. Because the other thing that she was a pediatrician, right, or is a pediatrician, is that the other thing that's not talked about is the huge masses of untreated burn victims too, right? She did a calculation out from the center of the explosion, ring by ring, so 1 mile, from 10 miles, from 20 miles, from 50 miles, from what the damage would be. And I'm telling you, it's like nobody really escaped it in one way or another. You know, it was nuclear sickness, as you said, or untreated burns, or, you know, whatever. It's just, and I guess we're being graphic here, people, for a reason. You've got to wake up. You know, that's why one of the reasons Scott is on today, because Scott understands, and I understand, having covered this the last time, that, well, not Cuban Missile, I wasn't a reporter then, but I was covering people who desperately wanted to end the arms race. And I kind of felt foolishly after doing that work 30, 40 years ago that we were good. You know, I kind of let it go. And now here we are again.
I remember those times.
Right?
You know, speaking of Helen Caldicott, someone told me, I think it was a guest on my show, informed me that Helen Caldicott had met with Ronald Reagan's daughter, insisted that he meet her, and that she really got through to him. This was one of the things that had really made the change for Ronald Reagan, was he had seen the day after, which especially for 1983, but even now is a pretty realistic depiction of what it would look like for the American Midwest to get nuked. And he saw that and went, whoa, man. And then he met with, I think Caldicott came after that. And then somehow after that, and I really should read his diary and all of this stuff as published. I know there's a lot to this. But he essentially decided, like John Belushi, he was on a mission from God, that God must have put him here to get rid of all the nukes. And that was when he went from MX missiles and Pershing missiles, and we're going to ratchet this up and we're going to defeat the evil commies, to, and it was right around this time, of course, that Gorbachev came in and was only 41 years old, and Reagan was just able to essentially befriend him and figure out how to, you know, work with him. And they almost, I'm sure you know the story, at Reykjavik, they really did almost come to agreement on a deal to abolish all nuclear weapons. They did end up signing the INF treaty that took all medium range and short range missiles out of Europe. But they failed to sign the treaty. And it wasn't a magic wish. It was Ronald Reagan we're talking about here. But the deal was that we would go down to about 200 nukes each, us and the Soviets. This is 86. This is long before they even opened the border between Hungary and Austria, and the beginning of the unraveling had even begun at all. This is when everybody thought the evil empire was going to live into the new century, as far as anyone was concerned, certainly as far as Reagan was concerned. Even if we could end the Cold War, he didn't think the Soviet Union was going to go away. But he said, we ought to have this deal where we go down to 200 nukes each, which would put us at parity with England, France, China, and Israel. And then after that, that was before North Korea, and I don't know if South Africa had nukes by then. But anyway, it would put us at parity with the other nuclear weapon states. And of course, this is before India and Pakistan had nukes. And then from there, we would continue to try to negotiate. Let's see if we can get down to 100. Let's see if we can get down to 50. What do the scientists say is the bare minimum to avoid nuclear winter? Can we get down to that level? So even if we do have worst case scenario, war breaks out, we don't kill all of humanity. Can we try that? And then maybe we could even get down to fewer than that. Maybe we could get down to a couple of good submarines each, right? Or, this kind of thing. And eventually, and of course, this sounds crazy to say in the fall of 22 because of the horrible politics now. But the point then was the spirit of friendship and cooperation, which, by the way, America, Ukraine, and Russia just worked together to launch another rocket into space the other day. Did you know that? We're still working with them. And that should be the basis of all of our, spirit here. But the idea was that if we're getting along and we got Gorbachev doing Pizza Hut commercials and we're going over there and not like Bill Clinton kicking them while they're down, but really trying to treat them like friends, then we can do this in a spirit of cooperation and friendship where we do not have to have, in other words, again, this is Reaganite policy we're talking about here. We are not talking about hippie girls in sundresses with flowers in their hair and daydreams in their mind. We're talking about George Shultz and Ronald Reagan saying, we think we can make this deal with these commies. Let's try it. That ought to tell you right there that this should be within the realm, right from like a social psychological point of view. It's okay for anyone to agree with Helen Caldicott about this. You don't have to agree with her about whatever her social welfare policies are necessarily to understand she is right about this whole thing about we should not be holding on to these nukes. William Perry was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, and he was like a wonk civilian, technocrat from the Pentagon who like rose to the ranks of Secretary of Defense. So he was not like a partisan Democrat type political appointee or a guy from a corporate America either. He was like a total egghead, wonky sort of whatever. Anyway, so he's spending now his retirement and his final years on this planet writing books about and speaking about how we've got to abolish nuclear weapons.
Wow.
And essentially his story is kind of what I'm saying here too, which is you people don't understand the power of these machines the way that I do. If you really knew what the hell we meant when we talk about an H-bomb, you would have to get on board. You do not have to be a hippie girl in a sundress. You could be Ronald Reagan and know that this is not sustainable. The ultimate Mexican standoff between the major powers of the earth, threatening the entire existence of our species in order to keep the peace in this way, it's just not tenable. There's got to be another way. There absolutely has to, because otherwise, we all know the probability is they're going to go off. Somebody's going to use them. And hell, here we're having a conversation where, again, we're as close to nuclear war as we have been since the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev was putting nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, and Jack Kennedy was saying, dude, I'll blow up the whole world if you don't get those damn missiles out of there. Read me. That was the ultimatum, right? That's how close we were to war then, and all the best experts now say this is like that.
Well, I was on the
war. We didn't have a hot war with them then. We have a hot proxy war right on Russia's border. Look at the map. Kharkiv is 300 miles south of Moscow.
Yeah, I was looking at the bulletin of the atomic scientists this morning, and it's 100 seconds to midnight, right? Before Is that? I think what.
Yeah, well, you can't count on them. What do they know?
Well, and you know what? They haven't moved it in the last couple of months either. So that's kind of freaking me out, because every minute that ticks by in the situation we're in, it gets more dangerous for me. But this just highlights how we are not governed by serious people anymore. These are not serious people. They're not bright. They're not honest. They don't know the history. COVID nearly drove me mad with the incompetence and the ineptitude of the people running the public health response. But this makes them look like geniuses. It's astonishing that, I mean, you and I are kind of the old farts telling people they need to be paying attention here. Where are the generals? Petraeus was cheering it on. Jack Keane is cheering it on. I mean, what the hell? I don't get it.
Keane, you want to get me started on Keane and Petraeus or not?
Well, you know what? Colonel McGregor said they're all on the payroll of Raytheon or something. So that was his.
Look, I mean, David Petraeus is the most incompetent general since McClellan. He and Keane, they're the authors of both massive failed surges in Iraq. All they did was win the Iraq war for the Ayatollah. And all they did in Afghanistan was triple the war, kill a couple of 100,000 people, and fail anyway. They're both a couple of losers. Capital L, like a college girl doing the thing on the forehead. A loser. Dude. Go home. And this guy, Petraeus, he went to CIA. He tried to force the CIA analysts to falsely report that he'd won the Afghan war. And they refused to do it. They overthrew him instead, turned him into the FBI for leaking secrets to his mistress, secrets above top secret, direct transcripts of his conversations with Barack Obama over their war policy that he was leaking to this ridiculous woman who wrote his hagiographer, right? Like, this guy's an absolute disgrace. Oh, and of course, after leaving Afghanistan and taking over CIA, he went and committed high treason, backing the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, aka Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Libyan veterans of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in the Libyan war. And then he, with Hillary, and then later Panetta picked up where he left off, were pushing this mission to take all the jihadis and the weapons from Libya and move them on to Syria for the dirty war in Syria. All of it treason. You read all about it in Seymour Hersh's article, The Red Line and the Rat Line. Remember, Petraeus wasn't gone until like the summer of 2011. So all the first part of 2011, he was committing high treason. Now he's on TV saying if the Russians use a nuke, we will, and he must be speaking for the Pentagon, or I don't know about the White House, but he said very declaratively that if the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon in, meaning like a low yield atom bomb in Ukraine, that America will destroy their entire conventional army in Ukraine and sink their Black Sea Fleet.
Yeah, I heard
that. And that's after they're already using nukes. He's saying that's what we will do. Well, what does he think will happen then? What should any of us think will happen then if the most incompetent American general since McClellan gets his way? We'll all die. And 30,000 people or so who served under this guy have put guns in their mouths and blown their brains out because of his betrayal.
Yeah, I know.
Of their service, their dedication, their lives. He's allowed to speak on anything other than how many more dishes he has to wash. Is absolutely unbelievable, unforgivable that American society tolerates this at all. And Jack Keane, too, is a disgrace. I challenge Jack Keane to a debate. And Petraeus already is too much of a coward. Gene Epstein is trying to get him to debate me at the Soho Forum. He won't do it. Maybe Jack Keane is man enough to debate me.
Well, once they watch what you did to Bill Kristol, of course they're going to be afraid, because you've marshaled your facts, right? That they are arguing for something that is absurd logically. You cannot justify American bellicose foreign policy because it never works out. It never works out. It never has worked out. And the problem is that the taking of the moral high ground always by America in these things is becoming less and less tenable. I think for people are really beginning to understand it's like a bull in a china shop, around the world. And it's not, you diplomatically, you can't sustain it. It will be the end of America, that ridiculous idea that it needs to be, the world's policeman. And what really bugs me, I heard this the other day from somebody I was interviewing, I forget who, but they talk about how in Afghanistan, when they should have been long gone, they were still using the "we're here for women's rights" argument, which is complete BS. They don't give a shit about women and they don't care about women's rights, but they launch these things that fail, and then they grasp at these kind of straws for some kind of ongoing reason to be there. It's like, oh, well, yeah, we want girls to go to school, so I guess, it's just, I will say this too. I'm not ranting, but I am getting mad when the more I think about it. A lot of it has to do with the failing legacy media, which is absolutely hopeless, and I would say the laziness of people in Western cultures to fully understand the world. Why is it that my cab drivers know more about geopolitics than my neighbors do?
Yeah.
And my cab drivers usually know it because they're foreign born, right? They're immigrants, and they've figured it out.
Cab drivers are bright folk.
I know. Anyway, look, I am so glad you came on. I know there were people asking specifically to hear from you on some of these topics and to help us put the world in some framework that's better understandable, although it's a scary one. How do you sleep at night?
Not very well, honestly, but I smoke a lot of weed. It's a dream suppressant.
But you know what? Let me tell you something, Scott. I'm in recovery for alcoholism, 22 years sober. Right. So I can't even, well, thanks, but I can't even have a puff on a joint if I need to sleep, right? I've got to just tough it out. It's kind of brutal. Anyway.
Yeah. You know what? I think often that I need to start drinking, but I never do ever quite get around to it. But, it's been a while, but the last time I was drunk, I remember going, oh, this is what it feels like to not care for just a little while. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's a very liberating feeling. I can see why people would just want to drink all the time and not care all the time.
Yeah, well, it shuts off all the bad stuff and makes you feel super confident, right? So, yeah, it was a magic elixir for me for a while until it wasn't. And then I had to put it down and keep on going. And I'm really glad I did. But sometimes I lament that I can't just have a puff of a joint or a little glass of wine. But these things lead down the road to rack and ruin for me. So we don't do them. But
look, as long as you got your act together, first things first and all of that, I do have one positive and optimistic type of a thing to leave you with if you want.
What is it, Scott?
Well, there's this massive campaign going on right now to support 2 active, no fooling, real ass war powers resolutions in both houses of Congress right now. In the House, it's H.J. Res 87, and in the Senate, it's S.J. Res 56. And it does not end the war against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but it does end the war for them. And frankly, there's just no comparison. And the war against Al-Qaeda there killed hundreds, maybe low thousands of people. The war for them for the last 7.5 years has killed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Surely more than 500,000, maybe more than 1 million. I'm very pessimistic about what the epidemiologists are going to tell us about the excess death rate in that country. It's a deliberately inflicted famine by Saudi, UAE, and the United States of America on these poor people.
In Yemen, right?
Yeah. So, but then there's this huge campaign. There's more than 100 left-wing, libertarian, and right-wing groups in America right now, all working together to try to turn out calls and emails and letters to Congress, obviously to Senate and House, and to their staff. And especially for those of you who really understand this stuff well, you really could teach this to these people. I called Ted Cruz's office and I said, because someone on Twitter had pointed out to me this great tweet by Ted Cruz from 2015. And he said, listen, if we get rid of Assad, that could empower ISIS. It's not in America's national interest. In other words, he wasn't saying anything good about Assad other than Assad is holding a place that could be held by someone worse than him. And we should not, therefore, be helping that bad thing happen. Perfect. So I called his staff and I said, listen, I want to show you this tweet. Look it up. Here's what it says. See this? Okay. This is the exact same thing in Yemen right now. Okay. If we get rid of the Shiites in there, the Iranians' friends, just like in Syria, we could put AQAP in there instead. The Muslim Brotherhood, al-Islam in there instead. We can't have that, you see. So it's not a matter of moving left. It's not a matter of becoming a pacifist. Ted Cruz can be every bit the, warmongering right-wing security hawk that he postures himself to be, and be smarter than to support this horrible war that, frankly, we are on the wrong side of.
Yeah,
now,
totally.
when it comes to ending the war against AQAP, I'm out front on that too. I've been against the war against AQAP since such a thing existed. Even before Obama really got it going in 2009, I was against it back when it was just barely going on under W. Bush. And I'm for ending that as soon as possible. That's not really going to end until the AUMF of 2001 is repealed, no matter what. But this is, frankly, as every bit of bad a war as Iraq War II or Syria. And yet here we are. We actually have a chance. We, the people, us nobodies, have a chance to actually influence an end of a war. We didn't have this in the case of Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia. Still to this day, there's an unauthorized war we ought to have a resolution about. But here we have active, no fooling, really right now, war powers resolutions in the House and the Senate. We have Democratic-controlled Congress. It'd be much harder for Biden to veto it, though he could, I admit that. But still, the pressure would really be severe on him not to. And then if it passes, then it's not just unconstitutional, but then it's blatantly and specifically illegal for him to continue the war. And then at that point, he has to call off all support for Saudi and UAE. And at that point, their wars are over, because their wars are nothing without the American empire to back them up.
Absolutely. That is sort of an interesting idea for people to pursue. And just as we're saying goodbye, have you seen on Twitter, AOC was at some event in the last couple of days, and
it's pretty funny. Yeah, a couple of people were attacking her about Ukraine. But let me just say real quick on the Yemen thing.
Yeah.
That you can go to 833stopwar.com. 833. Isn't that great? Why didn't we all think of that a long time ago?
That's good.
That's the phone number. 833-STOP-WAR. But then it's also 833stopwar.com, and you can find bullet points about the war.
Okay.
And you find talking points to use on your congressmen and senators, including if you're talking to a Republican, tell them this. If you're talking to a Democrat, tell them that. And if you're talking to somebody who's already co-sponsoring it, tell them how much you love them like this. And, all of the resources that you need right there. It's a very simple website, short and sweet, so that you and your mom and your sister and your coworkers and your brother and all their friends and family too, through the power of multiplication tables, we can turn out tens of thousands of calls. People, you got to do it, though. You can't just hear me talk about it. You got to actually pick up the phone, too. You got to participate in the thing. You got to ask your girlfriend or boyfriend or husband or wife and grown son, too, to all participate, or it doesn't happen. But if we do it, then it happens.
So say again who they contact?
You just go to 833stopwar.com. They have all the information there, and then that's the number to call. You put in your zip code, and it will forward you on to your senators and then your congressmen. And so you can talk to their staff and tell them what to do. It's all real simple, easy process to do. Wow. And of course, otherwise people can just look it up and call the Capitol switchboard and get a hold of their congressmen and their senators' staff and just let them know that, look, this war, one, is an absolute atrocity and humanitarian catastrophe. It's really, really bad, and we absolutely have to stop it. And two, it's absolutely contrary to America's national interest. We are really, don't call it treason and get them all excited, maybe to a Republican, but just tell them, look, this war is helping Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
That's a good talking point. Yeah, that's a good point.
You have to oversell it, but that's the truth. And let them know. This isn't even the war on terrorism, dude. This is the war for terrorism. At the very least, we ought to switch sides back before we quit altogether. Okay. And I'm telling you, look, again, on one side, on the war against AQAP, which was horrible, killed thousands. This war is killing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Yeah. Okay. So through bombing, but also through starvation and blockade and all of this. It's so wrong. It's as bad as Iraq War II, but we really can do something about it right now.
And that's good to know. And I'll tell you why, because the hour is short. I agree with you that we are as close as we've ever been to the end, meaning a nuclear war. And people have to really wake up and fully take that on. Everybody who listens to the show knows I'm a pretty sober person. I'm not inflammatory. Neither is Scott. And the smart people, even Colonel McGregor, everybody who's thinking is worried about it. And we have to kind of hold that thought and not let them get away with the rhetoric. I mean, I don't know why Prime Minister Trudeau is doing his thing. Well, we do, because he's a big globalist now, and that's what they want. But I mean, don't, speak about it locally, speak about it to your MPs, wherever you live, and say, we don't want this. We want Ukraine and Russia to go to the peace talks table, which they kind of were doing, and then Biden put the kibosh. It's just ridiculous. This cannot go on, and we need to be taking it very, very seriously. Scott, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for everything you do.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful for you giving me this opportunity to speak to your audience today. Thank you.
I'll talk to you soon. So that was my interview with Scott Horton of antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute. He's a writer. He has a radio show. He has a podcast. And he's the guy, one of the first people I want to hear from when things are going south in a foreign land and a war starts popping. He's the guy, him and Colonel McGregor mostly. But I said that I wanted to play for you a little bit of If You Love This Planet. It was a National Film Board of Canada short documentary made in 1982. It features Dr. Helen Caldicott talking about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And what she does is very, very interesting. She approaches it from a medical perspective, right? She describes in detail everything that would happen if a nuclear bomb was dropped, going out ring by ring, at ground zero, at 1 mile, at 2 miles. It's really, really scary. The film won an Oscar in 1982 for Best Documentary Short Subject. CBC initially refused to air the film, calling it biased. So it debuted in the United Kingdom when it was screened by the London Socialist Film Co-op. So there you go. Very, very important film. It was a lecture given to SUNY Plattsburgh, New York students. And it's really a very, very important little documentary that we should be thinking a lot about now. We got to wake up, people. So I'm just going to leave you with a little section of If You Love This Planet. This is Helen Caldicott speaking.
The National Academy of Sciences in 1975 estimated if both superpowers used only 10% of the arsenals of their hydrogen bombs, 10%, it could destroy 50 to 80% of the ozone layer in the northern hemisphere and 30 to 40% in the southern hemisphere. And some scientists think if only 20% of it is destroyed worldwide, it could blind every organism on the Earth. And people would die, the survivors would die of a synergistic combination of starvation, radiation sickness, epidemics of infection, sunburn, blindness, and grief. It would be the grief that would kill me. I would prefer to be dead, and it was Nikita Khrushchev who said, in fact, in the event of a nuclear war, the living will envy the dead.
I ask you to, at this very important moment in history, stay critical, and we'll see you.